services, including Pandora, started cutting direct deals with some of the record labels and started paying them directly. So we've combined those two revenue streams with this to get a better apples-to-apples comparison. Overall, it's been growing. You can see there was a bit of a downtick in 2017. I don't want to read too much into that because there's a lot of timing issues behind this, but overall it has been growing, although at a lower rate than the other pieces of the streaming market. So streaming is definitely the fun part of the industry to talk about. Of course, units still make up a third of the revenues for the industry, and the news there is not very good. Digital downloads have been declining for years now. One of the things we're seeing in the last couple of years that didn't used to be the case is that now both albums and tracks are declining rapidly. They were both declining about 25% in 2017 alone. For a while, we had seen digital albums hold up the market a little more strongly than digital tracks, but that has gone away. They're both decreasing relatively quickly. Physical sales have been declining as well, albeit recently at a lower pace. They had been declining quite quickly, but then in the last couple of years, it's flattened a bit. I think this is partially because they've become smaller, but also because of one other factor that I'll show in a minute. But for 2017, by value, this was only down about 4%, from 1.6 billion to 1.5 billion. So it continues to decline, but at a slower rate. Of course, physical includes the category that everybody loves talking about, the category we get the most questions about, vinyl. I think vinyl's terrific. I'm a big fan, and I love listening to it. I love when people ask about it, but it is worth keeping in mind that it's just 5% of the market. So it's a terrific niche. It does continue to grow over the last 2 years, 16%, so it's growing at single-digit percentages now. But it's still just 5% of the market. It's a quarter of the physical market, though. So this has really become the driver for physical, basically being able to hold up its revenue source. As I said, the industry has had quite a bit of transformation. This process was a lot simpler 20 years ago and 10 years ago than it was now. In the 90s, it was basically just what kind of plastic are you buying your music on? By the mid-2000s, we had added some digital categories, and now in 2017, we have this incredibly complex group of revenues as our companies have diversified their revenue streams. When we're pulling this data together, we're now tracking more than 20 different formats. It used to be a low single digit, and now we have a lot more to keep track of. So there's a lot of complexity in the industry. For me, one of the takeaways is that it makes it harder to explain what's going on. It used to be much easier to just look at one number and see how is the industry doing. It's why I hope this revenue data is helpful to everybody, because it includes all these different formats that can be very difficult to track and very difficult to put into things like album equivalents or consumption. So I hope that part is helpful. And as I said, you don't have to memorize this data because we have it all online. This is our newly revamped online revenue database. This is on the RIA website. It's public, and you can adjust all of these sliders and pick whichever pieces you want and look at format by format, year by year. We have this back to 1973, and certainly for anybody in this room or anybody who's doing research, I can send you the Excel files behind this so that you can look at the data more easily. So just one more thing. So I've been talking about the recorded music industry, and this harkens back to what Bonnie was talking about, very much inspired by what can be done with the federal data. We had an economist look at the music industry with a broader view. So instead of just looking at the recorded music side, we had him look at publishing, touring, radio, teaching, musical instruments, all the different ways music impacts the U.S. economy. And the effect is that we, instead of describing ourselves as this $8 billion recorded music industry, our impact on the broader U.S. economy is actually $143 billion. So you can really see that the value of music extends far beyond what we're talking about in terms of recorded music. It also supports 1.9 million jobs. I'm not saying that's how many people work through the music industry, but that is the broader impact that the industry has across the United States and including the downstream effects. We have a very shiny report on our website, and you'll see right here, these are actually very much the same states that Bonnie was talking about in terms of having the most impact for music: California, Florida, New York, Tennessee, and Texas. So thank you very much. We'll do questions after.
Okay, climbing the stairs, we have David Price. Here you go.
Thank you. I want to thank you, say thank you to Alan for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. I heard a lot of good things about last year's conference, so I'm very pleased to be able to come and report things to you this year. My name is David Price. I head up the Insight and Analysis team at IFPI. We represent the recorded music industry worldwide. We're like the worldwide version of the RAAA. We work across 60 countries where we have individual national organizations. We have around 1,300 individual record label and record company members worldwide. Those include all of the majors, all of the big record labels you've heard of. What I'm going to talk to you about today is data that we've gathered in the Global Music Report. Let me just go back one. Larry talked about this earlier. It used to be called the recording industry in numbers. It's basically the worldwide revenue figures for the recorded music industry for an individual year. So the Global Music Report 2018 looks at the industry for 2017. So the figures I'm going to give to you today are for the same period that Josh's figures were for the US. Just go on one. Two things that are important. First is that all of the data I report is trade value or wholesale value. It's the money that comes into the recorded companies. Josh's figures were retail, ours are trade. I think you said 8.7 billion for the US. We say 5.9 billion for the US. We're not saying that the industry is worth any less. We're simply looking at it slightly further along the value chain. The point that the money comes in to the individual recording companies. And the second thing to say is that all of this data is translated to a fixed US dollar exchange rate. So I'm going to be talking about revenues in Asia, in Latin America. We've translated it all at an exchange rate to the US dollar in 2017, just to be able to make comparisons. So I'm going to try and get through this entire presentation without mentioning the US again. Josh has just given you an excellent overview of what's going on in the United States. I'm going to talk more about the worldwide data and talk a little bit about particular areas that might not be on your radar necessarily, Asia, Latin America in particular. This is where we were at the end of 2017, $17.3 billion. That's an increase of 8.1% year on year. So that's the third year of consecutive growth. In Asia and Latin America, we're going to touch on in particular 4.5% growth in Asia, 17.7% growth in Latin America. And as Josh did, I'm going to put that in context. Remember, this again is trade data, so slightly different to the retail data that Josh said, but the picture is very similar. We start off up here in 1999 at $25 billion worldwide in the industry. We've ended up at about $17 billion, but you can see this long, long decline until we get to about 2014. Coincidentally, I joined the IFPI in 2014, so I've been taking commission on this rise over the last 3 years. I'm going to show you what that's made up of. So again, this is fairly similar to what Josh showed you for the US. This is physical revenue. Back in 1999, it was pretty much 100% physical industry. It was based on selling CDs, selling vinyl, selling whatever we could as a unit sale. And then as we come along, we start selling digital downloads. In about 2004, iTunes launched. And you can see that over time, it starts to temper, but never actually offsets the growing decline in physical revenue. So downloads were certainly a huge help to the industry, but they never really quite caught the imagination in the same way that streaming does. The really interesting thing I find about streaming revenue is just how recently we've seen this big increase. You way back in 2004, 2005, I think it's 2006, we signed the first, Warner I think signed the first contract with YouTube. But it's only in the last few years, you look at 2015, 2016, where streaming has really caught hold of the imagination, really caught hold of the public imagination, and started to dominate those revenue statistics. And it's only 2017 where streaming became the single biggest revenue source. 2016, we were still getting more money into the industry from physical sales than from streaming. Two other sources of revenue are both performance rights and synchronization revenues. This is money from public performance and broadcast rights, money from synchronization revenues. I have one slide on that, I might get to it depending on timing, but it's growing at a fairly decent rate year on year. It's become a fairly important part of the recording industry worldwide. Our main revenue sources, I'll go through this very, very quickly. Digital is now over 50% of the industry. That's when we include performance rights and sync. You can see how important streaming has become. $6.6 billion in 2017, growth of 41% worldwide. And you can see everywhere else, downloads down 20%, physical down 5%, small growths in both performance rights and sync, but they are much smaller parts of the overall industry. If we look at this, obviously streaming revenues by format, you can see again where that growth is, where the revenue is really coming from. And it does mirror what Josh showed in the US. Worldwide, it is those subscription audio streams that are really driving the revenue for streaming and driving the revenue in the whole industry. $5.2 billion from subscription streams, just under half a billion from ad-supported audio, so that's the free tiers of Spotify, free tiers of the streaming services we see in China, like QQ Music and so on. And then video streams, 860 million. So again, this goes back to the value gap that we were talking about earlier. We have other data from consumer surveys that show just how much time people spend listening to different types of streaming music. In 2017, YouTube and other video streaming services were responsible for, I think, 54% of all on-demand streaming. But we're only seeing about 12% of the revenue coming from the video streams. That's my only mention of the value gap during this presentation. So what you see here, this sort of breakdown, where you've got so much more coming from the subscription streams than anywhere else, is mirrored almost exactly worldwide. Slightly different in some countries. You can see in Latin America we have slightly higher ad-supported, where the infrastructure might not be there, that the state of the economy might not be there to let people subscribe to the subscription streams. But you can see, it is the bulk of the revenue is coming from those paid subscription streams. It's that recurring amount where people pay every month to get hold of their music. And again, this mirrors what I showed earlier. I'll go through this very quickly. These aren't major milestones necessarily, they're just things we picked out to punctuate this graph. This is the growth of the streaming revenue over time, and you can really see just how recently it has come to accelerate away. We are at 6.63 billion for streaming overall. We're double where we were in 2015, we're 4 times where we were in 2013, 10 times where we were in 2010 in terms of overall streaming revenues. It has really shot up, and it has only been recently where we've seen the subscription services come along and start to grab the public imagination that this has occurred. Now, what's really interesting is that rise in the last 2 years, and if you look at this across a range of countries, this is just total streaming revenues. US, UK, Germany, Australia, Canada, Brazil. If you look at almost any country in the world and look at total streaming revenues over the last few years, you see this same beginning of that classic technology S-curve. It's not leveling off necessarily in any of these countries. So one of the questions, one of the really interesting questions to ask is when we reach that ceiling, when things do start to level off, when's that going to be? And if you look at some countries, I haven't put a slide up, but if you look at, for instance, Sweden and Norway, which are very far along this streaming, very mature when it comes to streaming adoption, they're still growing. Sweden's had Spotify since 2008, it's the homegrown hero there. But Sweden never quite had this sudden shoot up that we see in these other countries. It's a slightly different music economy there, but it's still growing. I think streaming was up something like 8-10% in Sweden. So even though we're further along, there's still growth in these areas. And it's also important to note that we're still at very early stages of where streaming can go. Right now we have paid subscriptions, we have ad-supported streaming audio, we have ad-supported video. Where can we go? We've got $10 a month paid, we've got free, and we've got ads, we've got free video. There's room for huge innovation in that. There are other ways in which we can market streaming services, other ways in which we can push things out to people. Is there a more expensive option? We've got high fidelity streaming coming through, which might take some people. Is there a mid-range streaming offer that some people might be interested in? $5 a month, something similar. I think this is very, very exciting, but there's still a huge potential for where streaming might go in terms of how we can start offering things to people. So just a quick breakdown of revenues by region. This is overall revenue, this isn't just streaming. You can see North America, over a third of total revenue worldwide. Europe, about 1/3. Asia and Australasia, about a quarter between them. And then Latin America and the rest of the world taking up about 4.5-5%. Growth everywhere. Really strong growth in North America. Growth in Europe, growth in Asia, growth in Australasia, growth in Latin America. For the second year running, this is, I think, third year running actually, growth in every single region worldwide. So it's not just growth in a couple of places. The music industry is on a turn, and it's on a turn everywhere. This is Asia. I just wanted to dig down a little bit, one into Asia, one into Latin America. And, I mean, the most obvious thing is this. It's that physical block. And that physical block is coming almost entirely from Japan. I'm going to put up a slide about Japan in a moment. But you can see the growth in Asia, where you're seeing it, is from that yellow gold bar. It's from streaming. Where we see growth, it is being driven by that streaming section. If we look at the influence of Japan, this is all of Asia. So this doesn't include Australia and New Zealand, but includes all of the rest of Asia. This includes Japan, and in 2017, with Japan in there, 56% of total revenues were from physical, only 25% from streaming. Remove Japan completely, it's the second largest music market in the world. Remove Japan from looking at Asia, and it's completely different. 60% streaming, only 20% physical. Streaming is accelerating, physical is still declining, downloads are declining. It's a completely different picture once you take Japan out of the Asia landscape. This is Latin America. You can see again, I mean, physical here is just almost completely disappeared. Only $50 million coming from physical revenues in Latin America, and the huge growth again coming from streaming, which has really attracted huge numbers in Latin America. It has really helped rekindle a market that has been affected heavily by piracy, and quite heavily by some problems in the economies in Latin America. So our top 10 markets, I'm not mentioning that one because I said I wouldn't. Japan is number 2, and then we have 3 European countries, Germany and the UK sort of go back and forth whether they're the 3rd or 4th largest market each year. Then we have France. South Korea had a fantastic year in 2017 to be number 6. Canada's 7, Australia's 8, Brazil is 9. China is now our top 10 market. The first time China has ever been a top 10 recorded music market. We'll talk about China in a second. So, Japan. Normally when I put these country slides up in the top corner I have a little picture of the country. The World Cup is on at the moment, so I've changed to football shirts. The Japan shirt it's a dark blue. It's got little white stripes down that I don't think you can see. It's actually the most boring shirt I'm going to show you. But again, Japan are doing really well at the World Cup. They've got their match tomorrow. We're hoping they're going to get through to the second round. Again, just look at that domination of physical. There is no other country that looks like this in the world when you look at their music landscape. Almost 3/4 of revenue in Japan is from physical. Slight decline this year, about 6%. Looking better in the first half of 2018. It's a state to itself. There is no other market like this. People love buying CDs. They buy multiple copies of the same CD for different groups. You get a group like AKB48 who have 48 members. They have different groups. They'll put out a single with 6 people performing the single. There will be a CD with each person of that group on the front of it. If you are a true fan of that group, you have to buy the CD because you have to you have to make your investment in that group. By buying the CD, you get to vote on who's going to sing in the next single. It's a tremendous market, a tremendous commercial market for selling physical goods. Streaming really hasn't taken off in Japan much compared to the physical market, but it's still worth $260 million. That's more than the revenue of any country outside of the top 10 in total. No other market makes more than 260 million outside of the top 10 markets worldwide. So we're still seeing a lot of revenue from streaming in Japan, but as a proportion, it's much lower than the rest of the economy, much lower than the rest of the revenue sources we're seeing in the country. There's a number of reasons for that, which I'm quite happy to discuss in questions. South Korea, really nice shirt. There's a fantastic bold red football shirt. It's one of my favorites. It's very plain, looks great. South Korea had a fantastic year. Just look at these figures. Physical up 53%, streaming up 47%, performance rights is low, but up as well. South Korea started following the Japanese model on the CD sales. South Korea had a number of huge groups that made a number of huge releases in 2017. And the record companies behind them started following that Japanese model of selling limited edition CDs, tying them in with the ability to buy concert tickets and other sorts of merchandise. So we saw this big jump in physical. We also saw this big jump in streaming. South Korea was very early to the streaming world. They were one of the first countries to start offering paid subscription streaming services way back, sort of 2003, 2004. Soribada came along and other services. So they've been used to streaming in Korea for a long time, and it's still growing very rapidly there. China had the best football shirt. This is the Chinese away kit. You can't see it, it is black, but it has this white thread on it of Chinese dragon, these pagodas. It looks fantastic if you can see that up close. China didn't make the World Cup. I just wanted to show you that shirt. The Chinese music economy is fascinating. 5 years ago, it was negligible. There was almost nothing there. You were dominated by piracy. And there's been so many changes in China over the last few years. A lot of it has come from the big internet companies. So we're looking at people like Tencent, as was mentioned earlier, Xiaomi, NetEase, these big internet conglomerates, like Google, like Facebook. They all have their own music streaming services. They all offer free licensed audio streaming services, so like a Spotify free service equivalent. They do offer paid subscription accounts, but not many people take them up. We have something like, what we said, 650 million users of these free licensed services. 650 million. Spotify has, 50, 60 million free users. This is a completely different level of music consumption that we see in China. The default for most people looking for music in China is to look on their free license service now. It's not to turn to piracy, it's to do this. They still do turn to piracy, but when they're doing that, it's primarily to top up what they can't find on their free license services. The coverage isn't as good on the free services. There's a lot of exclusives. There's still a lot of Western material that isn't available. But to have that base of 650 million users that you can start upselling subscription services to, imagine that potential. So China at the moment, 10th largest music economy in the world. Where's that going to go in 5 years' time? Someone mentioned the box office in China for movies. It's almost as big as it is in the US. Can China get there? When you've got 650 million people using your free services, you only have to convert 10% paying, $1, $2 a month, and we've got a very, very, very large market there. India have got a really nice shirt as well, it's a really good one. But India, again, India's always been kind of bubbling under. It's always been one of those markets that people have talked about as having potential a few years down the line once they sort themselves out. India's a country that may never sort itself out, but in terms of technology and infrastructure, there's been a huge change in the last 2 years. About 2 years ago, the richest guy in India, who runs a communications firm called Reliance, launched free mobile data access. He basically gave SIMs away to anyone in the country who wanted one, with 6 months free data. He basically established a 4G network across all of India and gave everybody free access to it for 6 months. Now that revolutionized what goes on in India, particularly in terms of telecommunications and access to data. Data costs in India have since come way, way, way down. And what people are starting to realize is that that leads to streaming, whether it's movies or music or something else. So we've seen this big change in India, just as we have in China, of 2/3 of the music revenue is now coming through streaming services. There's a lot to work out in India. Obviously, it's very much tied to the entertainment in India is very much tied to film. It's tied to Bollywood and Nollywood and Tollywood and all the other film industries in India. But there's still a huge amount of interest in music. There's a lot of interest in Western music, particularly rap and hip-hop. So where we go from this is really, really fascinating. And right now, it does look like this is like China 2 years ago. So where can this go as we go forward? China, 1.5 billion people. India's about 1.5 billion people, growing rapidly. The number of people with internet connections in India is growing rapidly. Everybody has a mobile phone. Data costs have come way down. It's a really exciting country to keep an eye on. Moving very quickly to Latin America, classic Brazil yellow World Cup shirts. They're having problems at the World Cup. They may not even qualify for the second round. Again, streaming. Two really interesting things to look at with Brazil. One is the amount of streaming. Actually, three really interesting things. One is the amount of streaming. The growth in streaming, 64% growth in 2017. The second is the tiny amount of physical, down to, $15 million, $16 million in physical revenue in Brazil. The economy's had a very hard time in Brazil, but there's still a lot of piracy out there. The third is the large amount of performance rights. Performance rights is usually very high in Latin America. Lots of public performance there. And you can see that that's mirrored across most Latin America countries, except for Mexico so much. Mexico have a really nice green shirt. Mexico, again, it's 18th largest music market in the world. Streaming 70% of the whole economy. Small amount of physical, tiny amount of performance rights. But again, you can see here, as you saw in Brazil, as you saw in India, as you saw in China, as you saw in the US, as you see in the UK, in Germany, in Australia, streaming is really the engine of growth here. And in most countries, it is that subscription revenue that is driving that growth. How much time do I have, Larry?
5.
Oh, plenty of time. Right. Vinyl. Josh mentioned vinyl earlier. It is a fun topic to talk about, and it is one that a lot of people are very interested in. $631 million in revenue worldwide in vinyl. It has been on a growth over the last 3-4 years. 22% growth last year, 42.3 million units of vinyl sold. It's now 12% of all physical revenues, quite a bit lower than in the US, where it's a third? A quarter in the US, and 3.7% of total music industry revenues. So this is much more than just a tiny niche now. This has crossed into the mainstream. And if you look at this worldwide, US, UK, Germany, France, Japan, Japan's interesting. We have very strong growth still in Europe, very strong growth in Asia. This is something that has become part of the mainstream. And what's more interesting is that we're starting to see growth in supply as well as growth in demand. Demand has started outstripping. We hear a lot of complaints from labels about simply not having the capacity to be able to press the vinyl that they want to be able to press. So new pressing plants opening worldwide, Ireland, Korea, Japan, all over the world. There is more supply coming into the market, which will probably drive demand as well. Performance rights I mentioned slightly earlier. It's interesting to look at the breakdown here. The vast majority of performance rights are coming from Europe, less so from North America and Asia. One of the problems there is that there's no public performance right, no broadcast right in some of those countries. Latin America makes up 10% of performance rights worldwide, compared to about 4% of total music industry revenue. So there's, it's a slightly different picture here. But we have seen growth fairly constantly over the last 4 or 5 years. Big growth in 2016. One of the reasons for that is some one-off back payments for private copying levies in both Germany and France, and I think Canada, which means that growth in 2016 was unusually high, which means that the corresponding growth in 2017 was slightly lower than you'd expect. That's it. I may even be under time, which would be unusual. If you want to download the free version of the Global Music Report, it's available on IFPI. We have a commercial version which is much bigger and has a lot of more interesting data in it, which is available there. We have special rates for academics and researchers, so if you want to get hold of a copy, if you need a particular bit of data, do get in touch with me, and I'm quite happy to talk about what we can provide to you. Thank you very much for listening.
So I have a few questions for the folks here, and I hope that you will too. I want to start, David, with you. There was a comment that somebody made on the musicians panel that closed us out yesterday about his utter surprise of the streaming volume that he was seeing in Chile. And I thought, well, maybe not so surprising, considering what else is happening in Latin America. What would you say to a U.S. artist or a U.S.-based music manager seeing, now that we're in a global music economy, green shoots beginning to sprout up in places like Chile?
It is a really fascinating time. I mean, as you say, the ability to promote music and have your music consumed worldwide is a massive opportunity. I think you have to think very carefully about where you put your resources and where to promote your music. But the data that you can get from the DSPs about where your music is being consumed